this is the first lesson for paper 3, Germany and the impact of World War I, 1914 to 1918. Now, this is going to be the first of many lessons. We're going to go through what you include in this paper, but this paper is one of the very content-heavy papers, but also one where, in the exam, there's some very easy wins in terms of the exam. So before we do the lesson today, I thought I'd go through how the Germany paper is structured. Now, the Germany paper is the only paper in the GCSE where there's one set topic. The other papers, you've got to do different topics in the time allotted. Now, the Germany paper is 1 hour and 20 minutes. It will be the last paper you sit. And it's split into 2 sections. So, section A is an inference of a source question. That's a 4-marker, and for this question, you need no knowledge. Then the second question of section A is an explain 12-marker, and they're your normal 3 Peel paragraphs, about 15 to 17 minutes. Remember, 3 is the golden number. If you can't reach 3, 2 is okay. Be careful with just doing 1 piece of evidence explain, just in case it's wrong. You will be given stimulus points. You can use them, you don't need to. It's totally up to you, as long as you talk about 3 different things. Now, section B is very different. This is one which causes students some anxiety to an extent. Section B is all on one topic. And so, for example, in last year's GCSE, it was about women in Nazi Germany. The year before that, it was about the challenges that the Weimar faced in the years 1919 to 1923. So section B includes a how useful are 2 sources, an 8-marker. This is where you do your COP, and it's the same question you get on the Western front paper. The next 3 questions are new types of questions that you would not have done at GCSE yet. Luckily, 2 of them require 0 knowledge, and it's about how you answer them. Now, 3B, 3C, and 3D are all about interpretations. Interpretation is a historian's view, and you've got for 3B, you've got to identify a difference between 2 interpretations. In 3C, you've got to identify why the interpretations are different. And 3D is a 16-mark how far do you agree question. But instead of doing it like you normally do, you have to use 2 interpretations to come to your final conclusion. That is probably one of the toughest questions, but it's something that with practice, you can quite easily obtain quite strong marks for that question. So this is a Germany paper. Now, if you look at it very carefully, out of 52 marks, 12 of the marks require no knowledge. So you can grade this paper without knowing anything, which isn't what we're aiming for at all. But it does mean that if you ace the 4 markers, you put yourself in a much stronger position to gain a grade 6 and above on this paper. And that's where we really need to aim for the top, okay? The toughest question I personally think on this paper is probably the how useful question. It's a lot to do for 8 marks. So we are very much going to focus on spreading our skills to make sure that we know enough for each question, and especially we know how to answer these 4 markers to ensure that 100% of the time we get 4 out of 4. So, as I mentioned, today's lessons are on the Germany and the impact of World War I, 1914 to 1918. Now, what this course will entail is going to look at the initial stages of Germany. We're going to look at Germany between the years of 1918 and 1929. That's Unit 1. And we're going to look at a government called the Weimar Republic. The second unit is going to be looking at the rise of the Nazi Party from the years 1919 to 1933. And we're going to look at how Hitler started off in a very small party that didn't have much hope and building to probably one of the most feared political movements that we've probably seen in history. We're then going to look at 1933 to 1939 and look at how Hitler made his power stronger in Germany. And then Unit 4, the last unit, we're going to look at what life was like for people in Nazi Germany. So we're going to look at women, children, minorities, and we're going to look at the group that really defines Nazi Germany in regards to their poor treatment, the Jews. So, what you've got here is a table of what Germany was like before the war and what Germany was like after the war. Now, the one thing you need to understand, and hopefully we know this, is that Germany lost the war. So before the war, The Germans were a proud country. They were patriotic. They felt strong nationalism, which meant they were proud of their country. Their Kaiser, the Kaiser was basically a dictator. Okay, so before the war, Germany had a dictator in charge, a military dictator. Germany also had one of the finest armies in the world before the war, which is why the shock of the First World War caused a lot of problems for the new government. And Germany also had a very strong economy, which had prospering business, well-educated, well-fed workforce. And after the war, it was pretty horrific. Okay, so we're not going to go through the events of the war. I mean, this links to what you did in year 8. But after the war, the German army was defeated. The Kaiser had abdicated. The Kaiser actually left Germany and went to Holland. German people went through one of the worst times of their life, where they were surviving on turnips and bread that were mixed with sawdust. So the people of Germany went through a horrendous time where their economy had basically collapsed. On top of the impact of the war, Germany also faced a flu epidemic, which killed thousands of people. Now, these people were already weakened by the rations of food, so that their health, their immune system was very weak. Germany were at rock bottom after the First World War. Now, if I'm looking at the pessimistic view and thinking about what's the worst question you could get as a year 11 sitting paper 3, I think it could be something about explaining why the First World War had a serious effect on Germany. Why I think this is so harsh is because it's one of the first lessons you do, and it's not one of the biggest topics we cover, but we've got to be prepared for every eventuality in this GCSE. So, we are going to look at the impact of World War I on Germany, and to do this, we have to look at political, social, and economic. Now, to make sure we have a full awareness of what each of these terms mean, political means there were changes in how the country was run. Social means it has an impact on the people. So it's to do with everyday people. And economic means money, having an impact on the money that's coming into Germany. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put a slide up on the next page, and I'd like you just to read through and pause the video and see if you can match them into political, social, and economic. So I'm going to put the slide on, pause the video, see what you can do, and then start up again so we can go through them. Right. So hopefully you've paused it and you've gone through and you've tried to work out what each of the phrases links with. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to go through each one. I'm going to write whether it's political, social, or economic. So I'm just going to put P, E, or S, and then we'll go from there. So, national income was about 1/3 of what it had been. They were getting nowhere near as much money. Now, what that means is Germany were getting about they're only getting about 33% of what they were used to. And in that respect, this is going to be economic. Now, this is really bad for Germany. I mean, we look at the amount of money a country gets. If that suddenly stops, and that's going to lead to people losing jobs, it's going to lead to people losing their faith in the government. It's pretty problematic, the fact that national income was 1/3 of what it had been. This is because of the war effort. Workers rebelled against their leaders, who they believed had led them to defeat in World War I. Now, this is going to be social and political. Now, what we need to understand is that after the war, the Kaiser, the man who was in charge during the First World War, he left. So the people that got the blame was this new government, which a lot of people actually comment on it being very unfair, because they actually weren't the leaders during the First World War. Okay. The war left 600,000 widows and 2 million children without their fathers. By 1925, the state was spending about 1/3 of its budget in war pensions. I mean, again, this links to money. This is economy. And also the fact that so many people were left, widowed, and children were left without fathers. This has definitely got to be social as well. In 1916-17, the potatoes ran out in Germany. This led to severe starvation during the turnip winter. This is social. Because of Germany going through a bad harvest and poor weather, It meant that a lot of people were surviving on turnips and bread, and they had to mix this with sawdust. People of Germany were not in a good place. During the war, women were called up to work in factories. Many people saw this as damaging to traditional family values and society as a whole. So, in sort of pre-war Germany, women were seen as traditional. Women were seen as people who should be at home looking after their families and their husbands. So the war had a big impact on the definition of women, because it meant that women were going back to work in factories while the men were away fighting the war. This is something that had an impact and a lot of traditional Germans didn't like. The war had deepened divisions in German society. Once again, this is social. Stresses of war led to a revolution and became a democratic republic, the Weimar Republic. This is the name you need to remember, okay? The Weimar Republic. This is the name of the new government after the First World War. We're going to talk about the Weimar a lot over the next 10 lessons, and they're in existence till 1933. This is the last republic that was in place before the role of Hitler. But the big thing is that it was a new government. It went from a dictatorship to a democracy, which was more free, which allowed Germany to try something totally different. Only 50% of the butter and 60% of milk was being produced. It could not import goods because the British blocked ports. This is going to be a social reason. So because the British were blocking ports into Germany, they weren't getting as much butter and milk, which meant rationing had to happen. There were huge gaps between the living standards of the rich and the poor. This is social. And you could argue to a degree it's economics because it's to do with money. Industrial production was about 2/3 of what it had been. It's definitely the economy. They're making less because they can't trade, which means workers are going to lose their jobs. Germany was virtually bankrupt economy. The fact that the Germans had gone through this war, then they were going through a depression, meant that Germany basically had no money. Who's going to get the blame? This group here, the Weimar Republic, which is unfair because they weren't in charge at the time. In 1917, Spanish flu hit Germany, killing 750,000 people. So on top of all this depression from the war, they also got hit with the Spanish flu, which killed many people in Germany. So on top of that, that's going to cause more anger, more upset, more depression. It's a problem for people of Germany. Many German workers were bitter at the restrictions placed in their earnings during the war, while factory owners had made vast fortunes. Now this group here, the German workers, were a group that had to be won over by the government. They were a group that had to be won over by anyone in Germany if they wanted to be successful in politics. And we're going to talk about this a bit later, but the German workers, because they made up such a vast number of the population, are absolutely vital for the political parties to get power. The fact they were unhappy and the factory owners been making a lot more money, this is going to cause divisions, so social. It very much links to this one here. The German people felt stabbed in the back by the politicians who had signed the armistice, peace agreement to end World War I. Now, the people who signed this armistice were actually the individuals of the new republic. Now, the armistice was signed, hopefully we know this date, on the 11th of November 1918. Okay? German people felt stabbed in the back. They didn't trust the new government. Therefore, it's going to be social and political. Many ex-soldiers and civilians despised the new democratic leaders and came to believe that their heroic leader, Field Marshal Hindenburg, had been portrayed by weak politicians. I mean, that's political and social. We're going to talk about Hindenburg later. Some of these words might not make much sense, like democratic, that's new to you, but we can go through that. The Kaiser abdicated to Holland because the British would not call an end to the war unless this happened. This led to the new Weimar Republic because the Kaiser, a man called Kaiser Wilhelm II, he left. So, these are the political, economic and social impacts on the First World War on Germany. And what I'd like you to do is pause the video here and you're going to do a little task which I'm just going to put in the top corner. Write a P paragraph explaining one reason why Germany had problems after, or you say during the First World War. Spend 5 minutes writing a P paragraph on that. Remember, focus on during. The key thing about a P paragraph is what you've got here is your evidence. You must then explain why it caused problems. This caused a problem because, and then that will help you develop a strong analytical answer. Pause the video here and give that a go. Now, the last thing we need to understand in today's lesson is how Germany set up a new republic, a new government. Now, what we need to understand is the period from November 1918 to July 1919 was not a good time for the new republic. The new leader, a man called Abert, did all he could to ensure that democracy went smoothly. He had to make sure that the people did not try and overthrow his government. So I'm going to put a list of statements, and we're going to go through how that would help him set up a new government. So, it's not many. Abert arranged for civil servants who had helped run Germany under the Kaiser to stay in office. They were told to work closely with education and make sure that taxes could be collected. Abert reassured the army they would not be reformed, changed. Officers kept their rank. Abert also reassured the leaders of industry like coal and shipping entrepreneur Steens that the Republic would not confiscate land or factories and that it would not control business. Abert won the support of the trade unions, group of workers who had protected the rights of other workers. He promised the trade union leader, Ligain, that the Republic would try and achieve an 8-hour day. So, Abert made some very good moves at the start. So, by arranging for the civil servants who would help run Germany under the Kaiser to stay in office, this allows some form of consistency, which is going to boost the morale of a key group in Germany. Why are they so key? Well, number one, they collect the taxes. And number two, they're working with education. So they ensure that children are still getting the education they need. By keeping the same people, there will be less anger and possibly less rebellion. Because can you imagine if he came in and sacked all these people? It would cause a massive problem. By promising the army they wouldn't be reformed, that is going to keep the army on your side. Now, the army were probably the biggest threat to the Weimar Republic. Why? Because if they wanted to overthrow them, they could. Okay? By keeping the army on side, it's that hope that, number one, the new government will be protected in a time of crisis, mainly. And number two, there can be a time of peace to let the wartime crisis calm down. Abert also reassured leaders of industry, coal and shipping, their land wouldn't be confiscated. Now, in some places, the government nationalised business where they take the land and then they have a chunk of the profits. Now, why is it important they promised the coal and shipping entrepreneur Steens that the Republic would not confiscate lands and factories? First of all, the new government needed trade to happen quickly. And to do this, they needed the leaders on their side. If trade was to improve, then the economy would improve as well, which is going to be better for the government because there'll be more jobs and people would be happier. Okay? And number three, by keeping the factory leaders on side, they will produce for you. If a factory leader said no, stop working to the workers, they could quite easily do that, which could economically cripple the country. Abert won the support of the trade unions. Now, this is important. Trade unions represent the workers. And in Germany, workers made up a huge percentage of the population. So, by keeping workers happy, there's going to be less strikes, less, you could potentially say less discontent, and the workers will continue working. And by promising an 8-hour day, it's going to keep them on side, which hopefully will result in votes and keep the government in some form of power. Okay, so this is what Abert did here. Really key, really important that you understand that he took actions to try and keep Germany in some form of good position after the First World War. Okay, so what you need to do to finish this lesson is, how did the war impact Germany in good ways and bad ways? So I want you to think about the period 1914 to 1919 and think about the good things that occurred maybe and the bad things that occurred. And then you can come to a conclusion about how damaging the war probably was for Germany, which has covered the first lesson on the impact of the First World War and Germany.